Hello and welcome to Dialect. I'm Tony Gosling. Dialect's Bristol's first podcast, set up in 2002 with a grant from the Scarman Trust. We're supposed to be on Bristol Community FM 93.2 every Tuesday at noon. That's bcfmradio.com. But for some reason, the management don't seem to have managed to get us broadcast. There's a conspiracy for you. This week, Chris Wilson from Leaf. It's a permaculture living project. He's now based in Bristol. Living ethically amongst friends. The project didn't finally work after several years. What has he learnt from the experience? Then Professor Alexander Azadgan. He does strategic global management and international political economy at Saddleback College in California. We talk to him about the geopolitical situation, mostly in the Middle East. Dialect's produced by volunteers. We're online at dialectradio.co.uk, and we're based at the People's Republic of Stokescroft on Jamaica Street. I'll give you our contact details at the end of the show.
My name's Chris Wilson, and about 6 years ago, I think, I was looking around for a community to join because I was very interested in this whole idea of sustainability, having just done the excellent Shift Bristol course, which is run by Sarah Pugh in Bristol. So I was looking around for a community that was going to practice permaculture.
But hang on, because sustainable stuff, surely you can do it just on your own, in your own home. You can be recycling, whatever, solar power, this kind of thing. Why do you need more than just your own home unit to do it?
Because it wasn't just the sustainability, it was the fact that I'd started reading about the situation that the global situation that we're in. I mean, the financial as well as ecological, and I was getting really scared. I mean, it was really bad, and I thought, well, I'd rather be part of the solution than part of the problem. And it's possible that people who live in communities on the land can ride this out. It doesn't look like they're going to be able to ride it out very easily in the cities. So I'd like to get involved in something that's basically on the land.
Well, before we talk about specifically what you were doing with your group, it's worth, I think, just looking back at 1990 in Russia, because they had a terrific economic collapse, complete collapse of the currency in 1990 in Russia. Really, I suppose this was the downside to glasnost, perestroika and all that, was that effectively all the international investors pretty much pulled out of Russia, seeing it then as a very bad bet. And that meant that there was enormous unemployment immediately and a terrific drop in wages, a mini financial crash, really. Yeah. And Russia was able to cope with it to a certain extent because of the way that society operates there. Is a lot of people went back to friends and relatives, even their own places in the country, and started doing work on the land to get food, that sort of thing. Where I mean, Britain, that just wouldn't be possible, surely.
No, it wouldn't. I mean, there are massive differences between the Soviet Union, as it was, and either Britain or America or any of the capitalist countries, which is that in the socialist countries, they were much more used to hardship, to making do, to looking after each other and so on and so forth, which we're not in this country. We've become ultra-individualistic.
Did you say mollycoddled? Is that pushing it too?
Well, I think that's a bit of a... in a way you could argue that. I mean, the welfare state was a great idea when it was first started, when there was plenty of money around, to slosh about. There isn't plenty of money around anymore, but we've become used to it. And, I mean, that's an argument. I'm not so sure where I stand on that. But it's been sustained at the moment by massive amounts of debt, and it can't go on. It simply can't. It never has done in the past, and it won't in the future.
Will it just keep going until the rich have managed to garner all of the... Because that seems to be the product of all of this, seems to be the rich getting richer. And at that point, there must come a point where that finishes. Surely they get
Well, there's more of us than there are of them. Let's put it that way. There are more pitchforks than machine guns, you could say. No, it's got to come to an end. It always has historically. I don't see any reason why it won't now. It just doesn't look very likely at the moment, because, I mean, the powers that the state have got are huge. They've got all the surveillance powers, they've got all the police powers, etc., etc. But it's being hollowed out from the inside in the same way that the Soviet Union was. The more centralised power you have, the less people start to believe in it. In the end, it collapses. I thought it was going to collapse imminently, which was my big mistake. Of course it's not. It's going to probably take a long time and a grinding down sort of process, but it will happen. It's bound to.
Okay, so let's get back to this attempt anyway, at forming a community.
Yeah.
So when did you actually start this project?
Well, I didn't start it personally. It was already started when I got involved. It was a little group that called themselves, I think they called themselves Prospect Permaculture Community or something. And what they were doing were talking about it, basically. They were getting together every month and they were talking about it. And there was a great talking shop. It reminded me a bit of the sort of left Maoist group, in Islington in the 1970s, when they'd be talking how to overthrow the capitalist system, and of course it would come to nothing. But there were some people in it who were determined to start this community, and all the people who were involved in this group, or virtually all of them, had enough money to put the money where their mouth was.
But what is permaculture?
Permaculture, oh my God. Permaculture is really a way of living on the land that goes with nature rather than against it. So it's intensive agriculture, but using natural means and really thinking about it before you put a spade in the soil, I mean, it's not hugely different from what we might call organic gardening, actually, but there is more to it. Well, there's a lot more to it than that.
So a kind of market gardening type, the idea that most of the people would be actually spending quite a lot of their time on
the land,
allotments around their homes, that sort of thing.
Yes, I mean, it's been done before. It was done before in the war. I mean, in the Second World War, we became very self-sufficient, almost entirely self-sufficient, actually, over a very short period of time, and it could be done again. But it wants to be done. It is no good doing it on industrial agriculture lines because, for one thing, when peak oil comes along, you're not going to be able to buy any fertilizers anymore because they're all oil-based, or no, they're not oil, but most of them are. You're not going to be able to buy pesticides and so on. They're already prohibitively expensive for most farmers around the world. This industrialized agriculture was a sort of phase we've gone through, which has wrecked most of our soils and must, like all these other things, come to an end at some point.
And what way has it wrecked the soil? Because it's still growing food for us.
It's growing food for us with the application of more and more fertilizers and pesticides, which is killing off the natural environment. There are many soils in the United States that are already exhausted and can only produce anything at all if you address them with large amounts of chemicals, which then get, of course, washed into the rivers and then into the sea, and they kill off all the aquatic life, etc., etc.
Okay. Anyway, so let's get back to the community.
Yeah.
Or the group trying to form a community.
Yeah.
Take us through, some of the discussions that you were having.
Oh, well, the discussions that we were having were very idealised. What sort of a place would we want to buy? Oh, it would have to be not too close to a motorway and not under a flight path, all sorts of things like that. It would have to be some sort of pond life and some sort of stream or water going through it. I mean, everything you can imagine went into these discussions. And how would we organise the community? Would we have it like this or like that? And we rather like the idea of sociocracy and all this kind of thing.
Hang on, what do you mean by that?
Sociocracy. It's a way of organising things whereby everybody has a say. It's sort of based on consensus decision making. Only it's a scaling up of it into kind of larger organisations. We wouldn't have needed sociocracy. Just, to make sure that everybody had a say in all the decisions is really what you want.
That's difficult, though, isn't it? I mean,
it's extremely difficult.
The thing is, all it takes is one person to veto everything, so often nothing at all gets done.
That's right. So you have to go by that wonderful rule, which is it's good enough for now, so we'll just try it. That I can't remember what the exact rule is, something like that.
Okay, so how close did you actually get to buying some land and actually building something?
We did it. We bought the land. And this is where things started to go wrong, because the people who had been running it before, the aged intellectuals, as it were, pulled out because they said, we don't like this place. We all loved it because it was a beautiful piece of land right on the River Torrington, but they didn't
Where's
like
that?
it. Where? In Devon, sorry, yeah.
Right.
Near Hatherley in Devon. And the people who were running the group didn't like it because they're getting on a bit. And,
I mean, how can you buy a bit of land that the people running the group didn't want?
We just split up, and those of us who wanted to buy the land bought the land. But this involved, I mean, there were 4 or 5 of us who were really, really keen on this, and there was another couple whose money we really needed to buy this place who weren't perhaps quite so keen, and in fact it proved to be a big stumbling block later on. But we needed that, they had about, 150 grand to put in or something, and we needed that money to buy this place. So we persuaded them to join up with us, and that should have rung a warning bell. If you have to persuade somebody, because the rest of us were already persuaded. It was such a great piece of land.
Okay, so how many acres was it and how much did it cost? It
was 14 acres. There was a big farmhouse and a very large barn conversion, which had residential planning permission on it. It was very rare. Gold dust, that is. And there were 14 acres. There was 7 acres of it was a water meadow, and we sort of just let that pass, Actually, a water meadow is not a whole hell of a lot of use because it gets inundated 2 or 3 times in the winter. But the rest of the land was good. I mean, you could grow on it. You could certainly grow stuff on it, and we did start to do that. We could have, 7 acres would have been enough, actually.
So by this point, you'd bought the land. What were you calling yourself?
I think the name Leaf came in as soon as we bought the land.
Right, that's living ethically.
Living ethically amongst friends.
Only thing was, some of the people weren't being very friendly.
Well, at first it was very good. At first it went really well because we were making headway on all fronts at once.
Okay, but were you living in mobile homes or something? Did you take some caravan?
No. We were living in these big buildings.
Right, together.
Yeah,
all
we all had separate rooms, but we used communal, bathrooms, and we all ate together in the communal kitchen, which was a bit of it was sometimes a bit of a pain because there was a couple of vegans and the rest of us weren't very vegan-y. And they used to produce stuff which was made of, I think it was called sauce mix or something, which is like a pink slime, and it's like imitation meat. But anyway, that aside, it was fun, and we got on well. We worked together quite well.
And initially, what was your main priorities within the work programme?
Well, there were 2 main priorities. The first one was to establish ourselves on the land. And there were 2 out of I think there were 9 of us originally, and there were 3 who were particularly interested in that, and they got going and worked on it. We built, a polytunnel and da-da-da-da-da.
Oh, the idea is to try and start growing some food straight away.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we did. We started growing food straight away. Absolutely, yeah, from the get-go.
What year was this?
Cracky. 2012, I think. Okay. Or was it 2013, one or the other?
Okay. So 5 years, 6 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. And like I say, it worked extremely well for the first, I think probably for about the first 18 months or 2 years maybe. Did we come to the breakup yet, or?
Well, it'd be nice to imagine that you've got more than just a polytunnel before things go wrong.
Yes, yeah.
Were you building things there? And,
yes, we were.
Doing landscaping, anything like that?
Yeah, all of that. The big project was that we disconnected the oil-fired central heating on both of the buildings, and we built an enormous, great boiler house with a big wood-fired boiler. And there was a lot of woodland around, and we were actually in an arrangement with the farmer whereby we were looking after his woodland. So there was plenty of stuff for us to feed into this huge boiler. That was my favourite project because I was the guy. I was a builder before, so I kind of ran this project, and none of us had done any sort of like commercial scale building before.
So you were the stoker of the boiler?
I didn't stoke it, no. I designed the building and sort of taught people how to put cement blocks up, and we all worked as a team. It was brilliant. No one had done it before. And there we were building this immense great boiler house.
Yeah, it's something I think, in your retirement about the idea of doing something completely new that's quite it keeps your old brain cells going.
Yeah, it does keep, that's right, yeah.
So
I was 70 when we started this damn thing.
Wow.
And I was up and down on scaffoldings, laying. I was just about all I could do. I mean, it knackered me. But there you are. I was also living in a van. I wasn't living in the main house.
Why not?
Because I preferred it. I really liked the idea of living in a van. I thought, right, here's my chance. So I did.
So would you have your little wood burner in the van?
Yeah, I had a little wood burner in the van. Yeah. And a compost toilet.
I mean,
in the van.
I don't want to be too cynical, but was the van there so that at any point you could just take off if you wanted to?
No, it was.
You were really committed to it.
No, it was partly because I was also volunteering at a place called Communes, which is down the road, and I'd go there in my van and I'd stay there, just sleep in the van, and then come back the following day.
What was that?
That was Communes was a land-based learning centre, which is about 40 miles away, and I was originally I was actually working in the joinery workshop there because they were building another. A sort of period building there.
Shouldn't you have really been 100% committed to your LEAF project?
Well, I entered the LEAF project when I was already committed to the Embacombe thing.
Okay.
So, and Embacombe was fun anyway. I was working with young people, I really enjoyed that.
Yes, passing on the knowledge.
I wasn't going to give that up for anything.
No, passing on the knowledge is
That's right,
crucial stuff, isn't it?
Teaching people joinery, for example.
So you built a boiler house.
Yeah.
Any other projects you managed before?
There were a lot of maintenance projects, putting a new roof on the duck house and putting new roofs on various other places. And I got to be, we also converted the basement of the big... the barn conversion into a flat for people who joined us subsequently. And I did a lot of work on that. There were 3 of us working on that, actually, but I did all the joinery work, the doors and the windows and so on that thing.
Okay, so how were you managing the shared ownership of it all? Because you've got a whole load of different individuals all owning one plot of land.
That was the clever bit, actually. That was the clever bit from the people who originally ran this little group. They knew about this financial engineering much better than I do. What we did was we formed a sort of, I think it was a cooperative. I'm pretty sure it was a co-op. And we all paid money into it. We had shares in it according to how much money we'd put in. And that was our sort of stake in it. But our participation in the community wasn't dependent on how much money we'd put in. In other words, it wasn't, you didn't have a number of votes, depending on the amount of money. That was all equal, but because it was such an idealistic thing, we didn't worry about the fact that some people put 3 times as much money as others. One of us put, I think, $5,000 in or something. I put 50 in. One of them actually put 170 in, which is a lot of money, But because we were so keen on the whole project, this didn't seem to matter at the time. But
anyway, things didn't quite go to plan, did they? You were hinting earlier, breakup. Was that to do with the ownership and shares and this sort of thing?
No, it wasn't to do with that at all. It was the old problem of there was a couple there, and there was a single young woman, and the bloke in the couple fell in love with the single woman, and they sort of tried to sort of avoid, to be in denial about it for a long, long time, and they succeeded quite well, actually. But you could see that something was brewing there.
Yeah.
And eventually it brewed, and, as these things do, and they eloped in a smart car, believe it or not. God. Two of them went off in a smart car with a couple of sort of supermarket bags with their clothes in, and that was it. That was the end of the community. Although, we staggered on for another more than a year, trying to find somebody to fill the gap. And of course, when they left, that was, I think it was $270,000 or something that we then owed them. And the rule of the thing was that we had a year to find this money by getting other people involved. Now, this would have worked very well if you had like 25 people, all of whom would put in like $30,000 or something, because that's not such a lot of money to find if 2 leave. Now, if you've got 2 who leave and it's $270,000 to find, that's just not on. And we didn't make it from that.
We should have had a rule in there saying that if you elope, you don't get anything.
That would have worked really well, actually. Yeah,
what for anyone thinking about doing this sort of thing in the future or in the present, what lessons did you think you learned other than, obviously don't allow a situation to develop like it did with this couple?
Yes. Well, we did all we could to sort of to plan for that sort of thing. We used to have weekly. Was it weekly? Yeah, weekly check-ins we used to have where everyone said what they needed to say about what was going on. And that worked quite well for a while. We had consensus decision-making, which also worked very well, surprisingly well, actually, for all the time we were there, even after these guys left. So we did the right thing.
How many were there once they'd gone? How many people were there?
Six or seven. Yeah. Six, sorry. There was the guy's wife, who was obviously left there, devastated. There was two couples. There was me, and that was it. Originally, we started with 9.
So you had to find this money?
We had to find this money, and it just wasn't possible. It simply wasn't on. I mean, if we had enough people being interested, possibly. But what they saw, of course, the people who did come and look, what they saw was an aging... an aging crew, because the two who left were the youngest and strongest, because they were the ones who fell in love with each other.
Crikey.
So,
but what about lessons for another group in the future? I mean, it's got to be possible to do this sort of thing. How would you do it?
Well, if I was going to use the same sort of financial structure as we had there...
Well, you don't have to. You might say, well, actually, that financial structure didn't work. We would have need a different one.
No, but it would have worked very well with more people. I mean, you'd need a minimum of 20 people, I would have thought. If there was a way of doing it, but there isn't, unfortunately, I would have opted for having people who were emotionally intelligent and weren't in denial about the fact that they'd been in love for a year.
But how do you know? You just can't tell.
No, you can't. No.
And anyway, these things just happen sometimes.
Yes, these things just happen sometimes.
So did you manage to make any money when you actually finally sold the land again?
When we finally sold it, you're assuming that we finally sold it.
Oh, haven't you?
It's been on the market.
Oh, God.
Well, what happened was that when we bought the place, we were so in love with it, we thought it was so wonderful that we were just pushing to get this thing through. And there were one or two glitches in the legal situation.
So did you pay over the odds for it, do you think?
No, we paid under the odds for it. I mean, the guy had been on the market for a year, and the guy actually reduced the price so that we could more easily afford it. We had a bit of a mortgage on it with the Ecological Mortgage Society. I can't remember what they're called. And he reduced the price from, I think it was from 700 and something to 650,000 grand. So, we got a big reduction. We put it on the market for 700,000, and we got a buyer, and they went right through to the last, it was almost on completion, and they found something else that was a legal flaw, and they just, at that point, they'd had enough, and they pulled out.
So was the original purchase not done quite correctly?
Yeah, it was flawed. Yeah, definitely. And that was partly because we'd really pushed. We wanted the place, so we'd pushed it. So what they're doing now, I mean, say they, because there's still a couple of them living there, are trying to iron out the flaws first, however long that takes, and then put it on the market again. But I mean, I've got, my 50 grand stake is still all locked up in buildings.
I mean, have you found somewhere else to live? Because, I mean, that's obviously...
I'm renting in Bristol.
You've got to, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm renting in Bristol right now. Yeah.
Crikey.
Yeah, and it's expensive too, on a state pension, But there you go.
So is there really nothing you can do you think? I mean, that's what you seem to be implying.
For me personally?
No, I'm talking about anyone doing this sort of project.
Right.
I mean, it seems to me
difficult.
what you're saying is something is always possible that something is going to crop up. There isn't any kind of hard and fast way of doing this.
No, there isn't. You're absolutely right. There's no hard and fast way of doing it. It seems that the communities that survive are ones which either have a charismatic leader or which have an ideology to which they all subscribe. Right. And permaculture is not enough of an ideology. It's usually a religious one.
Not an agricultural one.
Not an agricultural. Oh, God, no. Not an agricultural one.
So would you do it again?
If I was younger and if it was the right combination of people, yes, I would, because it was very exciting while it lasted, and it was really it galvanised you. You put all your energy into it. I mean, I'm 76 now or something, and I was hopping up and down scaffoldings, building this damn building because I was so keen. I don't think I could do it now. I certainly couldn't do it, as a living, as professionally anymore.
I mean, do you think also, because for a lot of young people, they're looking at their housing as being permanent renting?
Yeah. Well, they're not going to be able to afford 650 grand or whatever, are they? These properties cost you at least $500,000 now because land values are so high. I don't see much prospect of people being able to do it other than joining existing communities or spending some time in an existing community. Well, I think where the future lies much more is in bits like urban farming on the fringes, like the CSAs in Bristol. There's a very good CSA in Bristol just on the M32 corridor.
What's that?
I can't remember the name
CSA?
of it. Community something. Community supported agriculture.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's land adjacent to the M32, which is being used to, similar to allotments, but used to grow stuff on, which then comes out in grow boxes and people buy it through a scheme. I'm not being very explicit here, but that's
well, that's quite a good way of doing things, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and there's lots of urban agriculture here, on small plots of land in the city.
Are there any places around the city you think that have made it work, have done something which is a little bit breaking the mould a bit, maybe more communal than just a single family business?
Yes, but I'd be hard put to remember the names of them. There's a wonderful one that's again adjacent to the M32 on the road that used to go up to that big hospital.
Frenchay.
Yeah, Frenchay. That road, just on the left of that road, between that road and the M32. I'm not able to remember the name right now, but that is a wonderful place to go, for communal gardening, to learn the skill and so on and take it away with you.
And the trouble is, of course, a lot of people nowadays, particularly if you're living in a block of flats or something, you don't have any ground at all.
No, you don't.
Nothing. You can't grow anything, really, apart from maybe a few leaks in a window box.
Well, then I think we have to look to places like Detroit in the States where where abandoned plots are being just torn up and people are planting stuff on the land, or to look to Cuba. After the Soviet Union collapsed and they weren't supported any longer, they started tearing up car parks as well and growing stuff communally on the land. That's what will eventually happen here.
Well, a lot of things that happen in the US seem to happen here too, don't they?
Yes.
Particularly our mayor seems to be importing as much as he can from the United States, Marvin Rees. Not all of it good. But anyway, look, Chris Wilson, I think you've given us a fascinating insight and into a way to imaginatively spend your retirement. So thanks very much for joining us on Dialect.
Yes, I'd recommend the Shift Bristol course because that's a way of getting to know what's going on in the city, which I've forgotten all about it now because there's so much has happened since then. But go on the Shift Bristol course, contact Sarah Pugh. They're wonderful, brilliant people.
Okay, I'll put a link to that on our show page at dialectradio.co.uk. So, Chris Wilson, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Been a pleasure.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.
My name is Alexander Azadgan. I wonder if your audience remembers me from the last time we did one of these. I'm a professor of strategic global management and international political economy here in Southern California.
Okay, just a minute, because strategic global management, I mean, that sounds like a kind of almost like a New World Order course.
I know. Anything global, I totally understand your feeling about that. And also international. The word international was very controversial in the 20s and 30s because of the international list. So,
well, what was that? What was the international list?
Well, I don't want to really go into that because it's a very controversial area, and I don't want to. I don't want some of our colleagues who have a different religious persuasion to be insulted by that word. Henry Ford wrote a book called The International, and he was referring to basically the protocols of Zion and all this talk. So this is a very sensitive topic for our Jewish brothers and sisters, and so I don't want to I really don't want anyone's feelings to be hurt.
I think, but this is an important topic. I think that you've got a great. I mean, it's called globalization nowadays, but there seems to be an effort to manage the world globally, and there are some downsides to this, and there are some upsides to it. Obviously, if you want to do things like stop climate change. You're going to need to have international agreements. That's what groups like the UN are for.
So many NGOs are affiliated at the global level, and we've always had globalization going all the way back to the Silk Road from China all the way through Middle East and to Europe.
Yeah, but the downside of all of this is that you've got whoever controls that international system potentially can control the world. And so you get all of the power maniacs and psychopaths also kind of jumping on that bandwagon. Anyway, I wonder what you make of whether there is any real benefit to trying to think internationally anymore.
Well, like you said, it depends on who sets the standards. That is absolutely crucial. Who sets the metrics for this? Do we go with the Chinese model, which has we've had millions of jobs being exported to China from all over the world, literally, in order for them to control and maintain their restless young population from revolting. That's one model of globalization that's really not working for Europe nor America. And even Middle Eastern countries, you'll be surprised how everything's made in China over there. And so with the American model, now we're looking at the transatlantic alliance, sort of the continuation of the British colonialism and imperialism. And we have this Anglo-American empire, which still is very much in charge, although its power is dwindling in the decades to come because the Chinese are seriously challenging America's dominance, and they want to introduce their own petro-yuan system. So that's another topic. But going back to what you were saying, yes, the word globalization, global, for those who really understand the negative, the dark side of it, is an ugly term. So I find it ironic that I'm one of the critics of globalization, and yet I teach two courses that the first one has global in it and the second one has international in it. It's just that we are very objective and critical thinkers here at the college level, and so we try to present both sides of the argument, and we let the students decide.
So let's look at some of the pinch points in the modern world. I mean, Syria absolutely stands out head and shoulders above everywhere else. It's always, throughout the Cold War, the 60s and the 70s, it was quite clear that Syria is a point of conflict between the Soviet Union, as it was then, and NATO. But things have really come to a head in Syria, haven't they?
Yes, they have. Before I forget, Tony, one more thing about globalization and international. We hear this word every time, these three powers. Unfortunately, I have to say UK. I hope your audience doesn't get insulted. I'm talking about the policies at London. But every time we have UK, US, and France, especially in this last act of aggression against Syria, where they basically projected 103 missiles, they sort of hide and use this term in the international community. What international community? We have the non-aligned movement, which is disgusted by the so-called international community, which is really a few very powerful countries in Europe and North America and Australia. And Japan, of course.
But I mean, surely this is really just a propaganda term. I mean, it's not the international community.
But people fall for it, Tony.
Well, they do.
People in the UK are more sophisticated. In the United States, people fall for it. So every time they use this, neurolingual programming phrase, international community, and they're experts of that at the media, whether it's BBC or CNN. People think, oh yes, it's many countries in the world, and many of the 200 nations are part of this international community.
I suppose if it's more than just America on its own, it's the international community.
Yeah. It's more like an international club of a few European countries and US and Canada. So they use this term. They use this term to justify their aggression in Syria. And you're right to correct. You're right to point out that everybody's in Syria. You mentioned the Templars. We got the jihadi lunatics from Saudi Arabia and basically all over the world, where Wahhabism is the standard of propaganda misrepresenting Islam. And then we have Iranians, we have the Russians, we have in America, most people don't know, we have 2 illegal bases in Syria, totally illegal, totally against the American law, because it didn't get congressional approval. It's just part of the black budget. We have them. In northern Iraq, we have basically special forces from everywhere. We have Légion étrangère from France. We got British SAS. We even have German special forces there. So they're brewing something apocalyptic over there.
What do you think is playing out now in Syria? We've had these missile strikes, which have really been taking place outside international law. We've also now got some murmurings that the United States and Britain and the NATO countries may choose to just ignore the Chinese or the Russian veto at the United Nations.
I know, it's getting at the ridiculous level, especially when you have a lunatic like Nikki Haley representing the United States at the UN. Mr. Macron has grandiose manifest destiny illusions about himself, just as Donald Trump does. Even the French the media is trying to even project and hope this guy would be the second Napoleon. This is well documented. And there will be personality clashes between Trump and him. It's quite obvious by what has been said, their nonverbal language when they're together. It's quite obvious they're trying to outpower each other. NATO itself, I think, is a reactionary, it always has been, reactionary movement, as was the Warsaw Pact, against the other side, against the East, against the Russians in this case. So from that perspective, if the Russians sort of tone down their rhetoric, which they have every right not to because they feel an existential threat, then the idea of NATO will eventually die down. There were even some talks of it in the 90s when the Soviet Union fell in 1991 that we should really sort of, bring down the budget of NATO. President Trump's mandate, one of the things that he was very popular with here in the United States, especially with economic nationalists and what have you. I don't want to call him right-wing. This is just a vague misrepresentation, was that he wanted to have the NATO countries pay up. He talked about that openly. And then as soon as he got in, Mike Pence, his vice president, was sent to Europe, and he said the exact opposite. So he is not in the realm of power from the realistic perspective. We are talking about huge lobbying interest and banking interest, which basically determine everything.
Well, there seem to be quite a lot of things which Trump said he was going to do, which he hasn't actually done, or maybe possibly the opposite. So who's really in charge? It's obviously not him.
Right now, we have such a chaotic situation at the White House. We have had such high turnover, unprecedented, as a matter of fact, to some extent, with people coming in and going. Rex Tillerson, Mike Pompeo, this lunatic John Bolton, diehard neocon. We had economic nationalists like Stephen Bannon being edged out, General McMaster, who I'm not a big fan of, and of course the original NSA, National Security Advisor, General Flynn, who wanted a reconciliatory approach with Russia. So we basically have had a coup, and the old neocons, and to some extent there is no difference in neocons and neolibs. If you want to call the Hillary Clinton a neolib, Hillary Clinton was a hawk. So we have a situation where these people are slowly taking over, and we're going to have a continuation of the failed George W. Bush policies, and it's quite worrisome to us.
Who's calling the shots? Who's calling the shots if Trump isn't?
Well, I can tell you the MIC's calling the shots, military-industrial complex. To a great extent, those Dr. Strangelove generals at the Pentagon, and many other interests. Yeah, and also the Federal Reserve to some extent, because the American dollar will be losing its values in the decades to come. So they're very worried about that, for the dollar to maintain its value, and so there would be no other reserve currency that would challenge it.
So what are the big threats to the dollar then?
The big threats to the dollar at the moment, what we feel that the Chinese yuan is on the rise. And of course, the Chinese yuan has all sorts of issues, is artificially inflated. We are all aware of that. However, anyone who challenges the American domination when it comes to petroleum being only exchanged in dollar and using the fiat currency of the dollar, we're going to be at the threshold of World War III. I'm not an alarmist, but that's really what it is. China recently has signed around 46 contracts with 46 different countries where they want
the currencies of those two countries to be exchanged instead of bringing dollar into the equation. And this is going to reduce the demand for the dollar. When the demand for the dollar is reduced, we can have these ridiculous $1 trillion military adventurisms around the world, which, by the way, the people of the world are financing. The people of the world are financing these 103 missiles that were thrown at Syria because there's a demand for dollar and you're just printing dollars out of nowhere. We're going to have a hyperinflationary situation in this country that many of my colleagues, going back to the 90s, predicted would quite possibly cause the breakup of the United States into 10 regions, 10 economic regions. It's going to be some kind of a confederacy, and they're going to have perhaps their own currency. This is not far-fetched stuff. In the 90s, people were not paying attention, but we are discussing these issues at the academic level. So the yuan is the threat for the dollar.
Okay,
if you recall, Muammar Gaddafi challenged the U.S. dollar. He wanted to sell his petroleum into in a new monetary unit that would be used across Africa called the golden dinar, and they had to get rid of him. Saddam Hussein, a few years back in the early 2000s, wanted to sell his oil, at that time being the second producer of oil, of petroleum, in the Iraqi currency. He had to be disposed. But they can't do the same thing with China. They cannot have these policies with China. If you recall, a few weeks ago when Mr. Trump indicated he wanted to start a trade war with many countries of the world, actually, but at the helm, China, and tariffs and what have you, the Chinese immediately, within a few days, send their defense minister to Russia and having military exercises. So they were sending strong signals that you don't mess with us. And the Chinese are very even-handed and subtle and shrewd. So when they take such a extreme act, some may say, then they're sending very, very strong signals. We have the issue of Taiwan, which has always been very controversial between China and United States. China feels they are if I'm correct, they're the 19th province of China, and they will join the rest of it, just like Hong Kong did. So U.S. is going to take advantage of that. U.S. is going to take advantage of the North Korean situation, which the controlled mainstream media in this country is projecting as basically the Korean leader sort of, taking a few steps back. Nothing could be further from the truth. North Koreans want to be closer to South Korea to edge out the United States. Their policy is actually quite interesting, and the South Koreans are welcoming this.
Okay. Can we get back to the Middle East, though? Can we get back to the Middle East, though? Because I'm interested in how you think the conflict in Yemen, particularly, I mean, what's the agenda there? What's the point of it? It just seems to many people looking at it, it is by far the worst situation anywhere in the world for the population of Yemen, which is the poorest country in the Middle East. Right. We've got thousands and thousands of people now have died. I think it's something like 5,000, most of which are non-combatants. We've seen the biggest cholera outbreak in the modern ages in Yemen. What is the point? Who's behind it? And this is the main question asking you, Alexander, what's the point of this slaughter? Because it's not really a war, it's a slaughter by the Saudi Arabians using British jets and using British munitions, bombs, killing. And apparently, I was just reading the other day that there are no more military targets left in the whole of Yemen. So everywhere that they're bombing, including the wedding party where they killed 30 people or so recently, everywhere they're killing people is they're generally either houses or it's the civilian population that are dying.
Yes, killing 30 people at a wedding, this has been a standard operating procedure ever since Mr. Obama, who had his own kill list. They would go to parts of Pakistan in the Waziristan province where the Taliban is quite active. They would kill 140 people in order to get 2 terrorists. So this is modus operandi. Unfortunately, it has been. Yemen, you mentioned some figures. Actually, the correct figures are anywhere. These are UN estimates. Between 10 to 14,000 people that have been murdered. 100,000 children are suffering from all sorts of cholera and various diseases. So they're basically, the Saudis are destroying the next generation of the Yemenis. This is a tactic, unfortunately, which they have adopted from Israelis doing what they do to the Palestinians. Total psychological, damage and traumatizing of the next generation. Nikki Haley had the audacity to show that one missile that they found, and they said this was actually made in Iran, or the Iranians gave it to them, but they have the gall to get in front of UN and put Iran on the defense day, while unfortunately our British counterparts and here in Washington, they're sending millions, even billions of dollars to Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia at the moment is the biggest and the most lucrative arms market in the whole world.
Well, but look, why? This is the question that needs answering. It demands to be answered. You're saying whatever it is, something like 15,000 people then are dead in Yemen. Why?
14,000, anywhere between 10 to 14,000. Saudi Arabia feels an existential crisis when it comes to Yemen. You have to understand the Yemeni situation goes all the way back to the 50s. There's always been some kind of a civil war or some Saudi. The Saudis feel that this is their sphere of influence, as is the rest of the world. The rest of the Middle East. Quite a lot of hubris and arrogance there for a country who's not even 100 years old, by the way.
I mean, isn't Yemen actually really kind of part of the Saudi Arabia, or aren't they? Shouldn't they really be the same country? They certainly were if you go back long enough.
Yes, well, we had because, as you mentioned, Yemen is not only the poorest country in the Middle East, it's the poorest country in the Muslim world and in the Arab world. So this is a very destitute place. It's part of the Arabian Peninsula, but the Saudis, I'm afraid, think at least the entire Arabian Peninsula should be a sphere of influence for them. There were some communist activities going on in the 50s and 60s. If we recall, during the time of Kamal Nasser, they created this thing called the United Arab Republic, which consists of Egypt and Syria, and they wanted to bring Yemen into the fold. And the Saudis at that time felt extremely threatened by that because we had Pan Arabism back then, which was a direct challenge to the Saudi ultra-religious Wahhabism. So we have that sociological religious element to all this. And then resources is another issue, whatever is left in Yemen, which is really not much. And then we have this proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, where Iran is exerting its powers to the west, and I'm talking about Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, what they call the Shia Crescent. Nothing could be further from the truth. And then they believe, the Saudis, I'm afraid, are miscalculating and believing that this Shia Crescent would go all the way from Lebanon to Syria, to Iraq, to Iran, and then all the way down to Yemen. So they feel a sense of existential crisis at a time where they're very nervous because they're basically bankrupt for having financed so many terroristic activities, not just since 2001, but going back to the 1950s. We have evidence of this. There was an article by Khalil, I forgot his name, but he was the ambassador, U.S. ambassador in Afghanistan. He's an American of Afghani heritage. Then he was the U.S. ambassador in Iraq, and then finally a U.S. representative at the UN at the Political magazine, in which basically he laid out the fact that Saudi princes are coming to him. They're confessing that they have been basically financing all terrorist groups since the 1950s because they were really, really concerned and threatened by Pan-Arabism of Kamal Nasser. So there's historical elements to what they're doing in Yemen. There are geopolitical elements. There's religious elements. There is just basic hubris. And of course, they're all petrified. The GCC countries, Gulf Cooperation Council, which basically is, Saudi is at the helm. They're petrified of Iran. And no matter how many times Dr. Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, has acknowledged, he's on record saying that the Iranians are under no illusion that Saudi Arabia should not play a role in Middle East. But they exert the fact that they want the Saudis to acknowledge the Iranian role, which is a much more ancient civilization. So we have this total misunderstanding. And unfortunately, the man in charge in Saudi Arabia, de facto leader, Mohammed bin Salman, this 32-year-old so-called prince, he's a very diehard, aggressive, unexperienced, upstart.
But surely he represents a possibility of peace in the Middle East, since he seems to be getting closer and closer to Netanyahu.
Unfortunately, with the combination of Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Mohammed bin Salman, we are seeing we are being further and further from any peace process whatsoever. He doesn't have the tact. Mr. Mohammed bin Salman does not have the tact that his uncles had. You have to keep in mind that the Saudi, hierarchy went from brother to brother. went from the original king who had basically 9,000 children, and so he went from brother to brother, except that the youngest brother is really old. So he went from, and the youngest brother is King Salman, the old gentleman. It's going from him to his son, and this young man just lacks the tact, just lacks the experience. Let's go back to what happened in August of 2015, where there was a rampage in Mecca during the high season of pilgrimage, and something around 400 or 700, don't quote me, of Iranians were killed. And this was directly caused by Mr. Mohammed bin Salman's entourage. They blocked the road, people panicked, and they wanted to send a strong signal to the Iranians that we will even kill you during the Mecca pilgrimage. He was responsible for that, and Iranians were extremely upset for this for months. By the way, some of the bodies were never returned to the Iranians, which is a sign of massive disrespect when it comes to the Islamic belief. So this young man doesn't have compromise in mind. He thinks he's going to change the direction of that country. He has plagiarized, by the way, the reforms that Prince bin Talal, for example, always believed in for decades. Basically making, for example, down the line, making the hijab voluntary, letting women come to movie theaters, letting women drive. I mean, these kind of elementary rights that women had in the West for over 100 years, 120, when it comes to driving. So this guy has no understanding of how the region works. Unfortunately, the other princes that he has behind him, and you have to understand, the Saudi so-called royal family has around anywhere between 10 to 30,000 princes. He has some of those people behind him. We hear this propaganda that the Saudi youth are behind him. This is not true. This is a lie that Al Arabiya projects. Al Arabiya is the Saudi news channel, the main one, projects, and this is not true. Saudi Arabia, with the IPO, initial public offering, and making Aramco a public company, is on the verge of collapse. Now that the price of oil has gone to $70 a barrel, there might be some hope for them. But they would not make their, cash cow Aramco company public if they were not in deep trouble. Also, do not forget, Tony, that we are transitioning from petroleum to natural gas, and Saudi Arabia is in the 8th, ranking. The first two are U.S., Russia, followed by Iran and Qatar, or Qatar and Iran. They sort of go back and forth. So they feel an existential threat when it comes to future income, future revenues, cash flow from their Iranian and Qatari counterparts. So we have that element to it. That's why they're threatened by Qatar, and they have the ridiculous 13-item what do you call it? 13-item so-called proposal to the Qataris. The first one is shut down Al Jazeera. I mean, they have no concept of the modern world and how media functions. And I believe second or third, somewhere in the very top, is sever all your relations with Iran. Qataris happen to share the world's largest natural gas field under the Persian Gulf with the Iranians. They're not going to sacrifice or create a bad blood with the Iranians, even though they're part of the GCC, and there is bad blood between them because Qatar supported the terrorists in northern Iraq and Syria. They supported these ISIS monsters. But they're changing. There's a change of policy, massive change of policy going on in Qatar.
Okay,
so
look, at the end of the day here, the big powers raged against each other are Israel, backed by the US, and Iran in the Middle East. Do you see a conflict coming here? And if so, yes, will it drag in the superpowers?
Oh, that's $1 million question. Unfortunately, even as a person who's not an alarmist, I'm very concerned about this situation. Saudi Arabia and Israel are practically de facto allies. As a matter of fact, this is going to be publicized, and it's going, in the years to come, some say months, and they're going to be de jure legal allies, because there is this Iranophobia that both countries are quite petrified of and are trying to spread. Unfortunately, it doesn't help when our Iranian counterparts, the common Iranian person in the street, shouts death to this country or death to that country. That gives these people an excuse to project the spirit of existential crisis. But going back to your question, world wars begin. I mean, look at World War I. Over the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Serbia. Everybody was there. The Russians had interest, the Europeans, the French, the British, the Germans, certainly. And we all know what happened with that. So I'm not so concerned about the Israeli-Saudi alliance as far as the war coming. The Iranians don't have a death wish. They know if they attack either country, they're going to be, sent to the smithereens. They're going to be destroyed because those countries are both more powerful militaristically than Iran. I'm concerned about Syria, going back to our original point, because in this particular country, the Russians are not going to back off an inch. Neither are the Iranians. As a matter of fact, the Iranians are building 2 military bases. And if you recall, not too long ago, the Israelis bombed the so-called T4 military base. Those were strictly, to some extent, under the control of Iranians. So the Israelis feel a sense of existential threat from the Iranians because the Iranians are going to be their neighbor.
Now, I wonder, whether we can expect next the Russians to bomb, or maybe the Iranians to bomb a US base in Syria.
They won't. None of them would do that. I disagree with that notion or premise because they know that will give an excuse for U.S. to go into full mode of war. They know this guy in the United States, President Trump, wants war all around the world. They're quite aware of that. They're not going to be goaded into the war, both of those countries. But over Syria, they're not going to move an inch. So it's become a battle of wills. Again, I wish we could go back to Ronald Reagan days, and I can't believe I say that. Ronald Reagan, I was not a fan of him, but Ronald Reagan withdrew from Lebanon after the bombing. He withdrew from parts of the world. He was a balanced Republican, and he was a realistic Republican, and he was a practical Republican. I am afraid we are lacking this in the entire U.S. Political power structure at the federal level. We have crazy senators like John McCain, Lindsey Graham, among others. And then now you have President Trump at the helm, which, by the way, President Trump, his mandate was to end these wars, not to exacerbate them. None of us believed that, of course, when he looked at Clinton right in the eye in the third debate, if I'm correct, and told her, you have created ISIS. You and Mr. Obama created ISIS, and this war has cost us $6 trillion for the United States. Many of us didn't believe that, but the American masses, unfortunately, they did, and they thought, he would get us out of this meat grinder. That was Iraq and not Syria. I'm afraid this situation is going to escalate. We have an escalation of commitment here by the United States, and I'm afraid they're bringing the British and the French on board. Last time U.S. attacked Syria under President Obama, the British Parliament acted very responsibly and said, no way on hell are we going to come into this conflict. But I'm afraid with Prime Minister Theresa May, things are different. And just real brief, going back to the Saudi issue, the think tanks are in power. The Saudis last year, I don't know if it was 2016 or 2017, donated $150 million to various think tanks in Washington to come up with pseudo-scientific studies against Iran to create this panic at the intellectual level in Washington, or at least a pseudo-intellectual level in Washington. And this is on record. So those think tanks, I'm afraid, are no longer think tanks. They are basically Saudi lobbies.
Well, that's all for this week. Dialect's Bristol's first weekly MP3 podcast. You can download it to listen on your phone or in the car. You can subscribe and listen the week before broadcast at dialectradio.co.uk. Thanks to our guests, Chris Wilson from LEAF, the Permaculture Living Project, and Professor Alexander Azadgan from Saddleback College, California. Also to studio engineer Dave Bazanko. Dialect's a Bristol Broadband Co-op production. You should be able to catch us on Bristol Community FM 93.2 every Tuesday at noon, but somehow the broadcasts have been blocked for most of the last 2 months. Even though we're on their schedule, they're not being broadcast. Anyone can contribute to the programme though. You can contact us through the People's Republic of Stokes Croft, just off Jamaica Street, on 0117 909 6897. They're online at prsc.org.uk. You can volunteer with us or for hundreds of opportunities elsewhere in Britain via the national volunteering website do-it.org. That was Dialect, and I'm Tony Gosling, wishing you a very good week. Thanks for listening. Till the same time next week, goodbye for now.